November. If I were the wind. The wind that makes music in November corn is in a hurry. The stalks hum, the loose husks whisk skyward in half-playful swirls, and the wind hurries on. In the marsh, long windy waves surge across the grassy sloughs, beat against the far willows. A tree tries to argue, bare limbs waving, but there is no detaining the wind. On the sandbar there is only wind, and the river sliding seaward. Every wisp of grass is drawing circles on the sand. I wander over the bar to the driftwood log, where I sit and listen to the universal roar, and to the twinkle of wavelets on the shore. The river is lifeless. Not a duck, heron, marsh hawk, or gull but has sought refuge from the wind. Out of the clouds I hear a faint bark, as of a faraway dog. It is strange how the world cocks its ears at the sound, wondering. Soon it is louder, the honk of geese, invisible but coming on. The flock emerges from the low clouds, a tattered banner of birds, dipping and rising, blown up and blown down, blown together and blown apart, but advancing. The wind wrestling lovingly with each winnowing wing. When the flock is a blur in the far sky, I hear the last honk, sounding taps for summer. It is warm behind the driftwood now, for the wind is gone with the geese. So would I, if I were the wind. Axe in hand. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away, but he is no longer the only one to do so. When some remote ancestor of ours invented the shovel, he became a giver. He could plant a tree. And when the axe was invented, he became a taker. He could chop it down. Whoever owns land has thus assumed, whether he knows it or not, the divine functions of creating and destroying plants. Other ancestors, less remote, have since invented other tools, but each of these, upon close scrutiny, proves to be either an elaboration of or an accessory to the original pair of basic implements. We classify ourselves into vocations, each of which either wields some particular tool, or sells it, or repairs it, or sharpens it, or dispenses advice on how to do so. By such division of labors, we avoid responsibility for the misuse of any tool save our own. But there is one vocation, philosophy, which knows that all men, by what they think about and wish for, in effect wield all tools. It knows that men thus determine, by their manner of thinking and wishing, whether it is worthwhile to wield any. November is, for many reasons, the month for the axe. It is warm enough to grind an axe without freezing, but cold enough to fell a tree in comfort. The leaves are off the hardwoods, so that one can see just how the branches intertwine and what growth occurred last summer. Without this clear view of treetops, one cannot be sure which tree, if any, needs felling for the good of the land. I have read many definitions of what is a conservationist, and written not a few myself, but I suspect that the best one is written not with a pen, but with an axe. It is a matter of what a man thinks about while chopping, or while deciding what to chop. A conservationist is one who is humbly aware that with each stroke he is writing his signature on the face of his land. Signatures, of course, differ, whether written with axe or pen, and this is as it should be. I find it disconcerting to analyze, ex post facto, the reasons behind my own axe-in-hand decisions. I find, first of all, that not all trees are created free and equal. Where a white pine and a red birch are crowding each other, I have an a priori bias. I always cut the birch to favor the pine. Why? Well, first of all, I planted the pine with my shovel, whereas the birch crawled in under the fence and planted itself. My bias is thus to some extent paternal. But this cannot be the whole story, for if the pine were a natural seedling like the birch, I would value it even more. So I must dig deeper for the logic, if any, behind my bias. The birch is an abundant tree in my township, and becoming more so, whereas the pine is scarce and becoming scarcer. Perhaps my bias is for the underdog. But what would I do if my farm were further north, where pine is abundant and red birch is scarce? I confess I don't know. My farm is here. The pine will live for a century, the birch for half that. Do I fear my signature will fade? My neighbors have planted no pines, but all have many birches. Am I snobbish about having a woodlot of distinction? Pine stays greener all winter. The birch punches the clock in October. Do I favor the tree that, like myself, braves the winter wind? The pine will shelter a grouse, but the birch will feed him. Do I consider bed more important than board? The pine will ultimately bring $10 1,000, the birch $2. Have I an eye on the bank? All of these possible reasons for my bias seem to carry some weight, but none of them carries very much. So I try again. And perhaps there is something under this pine will ultimately grow a trailing arbutus, an Indian pipe, a pyrola, or a trin flower, whereas under the birch, a bottle gentiane is about the best to be hoped for. In this pine, a pileated woodpecker will ultimately chisel out a nest. In the birch, a hairy will have to suffice. In this pine, the wind will sing for me in April, at which time the birch is only rattling naked twigs. These possible reasons for my bias carry weight, but why? Does the pine stimulate my imagination and my hopes more deeply than the birch does? If so, is the indifference in the trees or in me? The only conclusion I have ever reached is that I love all trees, but I am in love with pines. As I said, November is the month for the axe, and as in other love affairs, there is skill in the exercise of bias. If the birch stands south of the pine and is taller, it will shade the pine's leader in the spring and thus discourage the pine weevil from laying her eggs there. The birch competition is a minor affliction compared with this weevil, whose progeny kills the pine's leader and thus deform the tree. It is interesting to meditate that this insect's preference for squatting in the sun determines not only her own continuity as a species, but also the future figure of my pine and my own success as a wielder of axe and shovel. Again, if a drouthy summer follows my removal from the birch's shade, the hotter soil may offset the lesser competition for water, and my pine be none the better for my bias. Lastly, if the birch's limbs rub the pine's terminal buds during the wind, the pine will surely be deformed, and the birch must either be removed, regardless of other considerations, or else it must be pruned of limbs each winter to a height greater than the pine's prospective summer growth. Such are the pros and cons the wielder of an axe must foresee, compare, and decide upon, with calm assurance that his bias will, on the average, prove to be something more than good intentions. The wielder of an axe has as many biases as there are species of tree on his farm. In the course of the years, he imputes to each species from his responses to their beauty or utility, and their responses to his labors or for or against them, a series of attributes that constitute a character. I am amazed to learn what diverse characters different men impute to one and the same tree. Thus, to me, the aspen is in good repute because he glorifies October and he feeds my grouse in winter, but to some of my neighbors he is a mere weed, perhaps because he sprouted so vigorously in the stump lots where their grandfathers were attempting to clear. I cannot sneer at this, for I find myself disliking the elms, whose resproutings threaten my pines. Again, the tamarack is to me the favorite second only to the white pine, because perhaps he is nearly extinct in my township, underdog bias, or because he sprinkles gold on October grouse, gunpowder bias, or because he sours the soil and enables it to grow the loveliest of our orchids, the showy lady slipper. On the other hand, foresters have excommunicated the tamaracks because he grows too slowly to pay compound interest. In order to clinch this dispute, they also mention that he succumbs periodically to episodics of sawfly. But this is 50 years hence from my tamarack, so I shall let my grandson worry about it. Meanwhile, my tamaracks are growing so lustily that my spirits soar with them skyward. To me, the ancient cottonwood is the greatest of trees because in his youth he shaded the buffalo and wore a halo of pigeons. And I like a young cottonwood because he may someday become ancient. But the farmer's wife, and hence the farmers, despises all cottonwoods because in June the female tree clogs the screens with cotton. The modern dogma is comfort at any cost. I find my biases more numerous than those of my neighbor because I have individual likings for many species that they lump under one aspersive category, brush. Thus I like the wahoo, partly because deer, rabbits, and mice are so avid to eat his square twigs and green bark, and partly because his eerie berries glow so warmly against November snow. I like the red dogwood because he feeds October robins, and the prickly ash because my woodcock takes their daily sunbath under the shelter of his thorns. I like the hazel because his October purple feeds my eye, and because his November catskins feed my deer and grouse. I like the bittersweet because my father did, and because the deer on the 1st of July of each year begins suddenly to eat the new leaves. And I've learned to predict this event to my guests, and I cannot dislike a plant that enables me, a mere professor, to blossom forth annually as a successful seer and prophet. It is evident that our plant biases are in part traditional. If your grandfather liked hickory nuts, you will like the hickory tree because your father told you to. If, on the other hand, your grandfather burned a log carrying a poison ivy vine and recklessly stood in the smoke, you will dislike the species no matter what crimson glories it warms your eyes each fall. It is also evident that our plant biases reflect not only vocations but avocations, with a delicate allocation of priority as between industry and indolence. The farmer would rather hunt grouse than milk cows, will not dislike hawthorn, no matter if he does invade his pasture. The coon hunter will not dislike basswood, and I know of quail hunters who bear no grudge against ragweed despite their annual bout with hay fever. Our biases are indeed a sensitive index of our affections, our tastes, our loyalties, our generosities, and our manner of wasting weekends. Be that as it may, I am content to waste mine in November with axe in hand.